Hello, I'm Gus Downing, publisher and editor of the D&D Daily, and this is the LP News Network. With the mobile consumer clearly in the driver's seat, and Amazon Go fueling this new cashierless era, the rush to create the perfect seamless shopping environment that eliminates friction at the checkout, if not the checkout itself, is reaching a fevered pitch never seen before, with some even declaring the front end to be wasted space destined to be better utilized. Every retailer is desperately hunting, searching, and piloting digital solutions that frees the customer from the lines that have plagued retailing since the beginning of retail itself. And all of this is happening at the speed no one could have imagined just 5 years ago, with some even predicting the end of the typical cashier position in the near future. From scan and go to mobile pay, self-checkout, kiosk, tablet-based solutions, buy online, pick up in store, to pickup lockers. These new POS technologies and experiences are rapidly changing, and the consumers are the ones demanding it. And therein lies the challenge and the risk. When the consumers have total control, the retailers have to respond. And in that response, oftentimes, security becomes an impediment or an afterthought, similar to what's happening in the IoT world. This demand for seamless shopping, the technology that delivers it, and the physical changes it creates in the stores is forcing retailers to completely rethink and reinvent the controls, the loss prevention policies and practices, and possibly even have to redefine the acceptable shrink levels. And with us today to talk about this massive change and the LP implications is Dan Faketty, Vice President, Asset Protection, Southeastern Grocers, and Chair of the NRF LP Council, and Mike Lamb, Vice President, Asset Protection and Safety at the Kroger Company, and NRF LP Council member. Gentlemen, thanks for being here today.
Good afternoon, Gus.
Good being here.
You know, Mike, coming out of Walmart and now being at Kroger, can you talk to the effort itself and how it's evolving and who is the main player driving it?
Well, I think the customer's driving it, Gus. I mean, I know at Kroger we talk about anything, anytime, anywhere. And just with the rapid change in which the consumer decides to make a purchase and how they want to make that purchase, I think is transforming our front ends in a way that we've never seen in the past. And I know that to be true for Kroger. So to me, it's the voice of the customer, I think, that's driving a lot of the change that we're seeing on the front end.
Mm-hmm. How's it evolving at Walmart and Kroger there? I mean, what are they talking about insofar as, is it scan and go and a mixture of scan and go and BOPIS, buy online, pick up in store? How is mobile playing into that?
Well, it's, speaking strictly for Kroger, the company I represent, it's really more centered on the expansion of our self-checkout robots, creating in a lot of our stores 2 separate corrals, sort of bookend between our staffed registers, and allowing us the opportunity to drive utilization, to provide the customer with that option to shop as he or she wishes to shop. So, the mobile pay, scan and go, is something that we introduced as part of the front-end transformation play, because that too is yet another avenue that we think some customers will seek. But clearly there is a big focus on self-checkout for Kroger, optimizing that in a way that's right for our business, right for our customer, and then right for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And there's been some studies out on that, came out of Europe recently, from a standpoint of the shrink levels and such. Do you have any knowledge of that study?
Yeah, and at Kroger we've done our own regression analysis. We've looked at utilization, we've looked at correlation to shrinkage and self-checkout usage as one component of the front-end change. And we think arguably it does add pressure to shrink. In my experiences, Gus, having done this for a lot of years, we've looked at a lot of video and we've seen scenarios in which I think the consumer sort of has reached new heights on the artistry of theft, in terms of just some of the games they play up there. It's the proverbial 30% off without the coupon. Yeah. And so I think you have to leverage both people and technology as you think about how you address that. But to be clear, it is the direction Kroger wants to go, needs to go, and we are going. Mm-hmm. We just want to make sure that as we go down that path, we're minimizing our exposure to loss.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that AI is even playing a part in this role from a standpoint of this new nudge theory that I've been reading about, in that 1/3 of the customers that either miss it or intentionally was going to take it, and you nudge them. what is that? Can you explain that a little bit for me?
Yeah, I believe there's a lot to be said about that, and we've seen it in some of the research we've done. In fact, we partnered with Dr. Reed Hayes and the LPRC more recently, and we sat down with a group of known offenders, and we talked about self-checkout, and we talked about why they take advantage of us at self-checkout. So nudging for a lot of people is the difference between doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing. And to the extent that you can leverage technology to do that nudging for you, rely a little bit less on the human factor, I think you're that further ahead of the game. So I think there's a lot to be said about that. Give people an option to do the right thing, and a good percentage of them will.
Is there technology out there available enough to most to be able to do that and implement it?
We think so. At Kroger, we're working with a solution provider and have been for a period of time where they are integrating their software with our CCTV and point of sale, and it's providing visibility to those types of scenarios that is very encouraging for us in terms of how we can then operationalize that tool, engage it from a service perspective, and really drive a more profitable business.
You recently came out of Walmart and they recently backed off a scan and go only after testing it in 100 stores or so. Any thoughts there or reasons? They had went public with not enough people were using it. I mean, that was really the public comment.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I can't or won't speak
Sure.
for the Walmart organization, but and you read the same thing I likely did. I think they cited 3 reasons principally: low adoption rate, an increased focus on SCO and the expansion of SCO for them, self-checkout. And I think thirdly and finally, and I don't know in what order, I think they listed perhaps a risk to shrink. But who knows? I mean, it's an avenue we're still pursuing at Kroger. And again, I think it ties back to anything, anytime, anywhere in terms of how you service that customer.
I had heard unofficially and unreported that one particular retailer that had adopted Scan and Go had a shrink increase of virtually 30%. I mean, would that kind of number alarm you? What do you feel about that kind of number? You think it's legitimate? You think it's something that could hypothetically happen? What's your response to that, Dan?
Oh, I think anything left unchecked, right? So if there's a retailer, we're in the grocery business, but if there's a retailer out there that has seen a 30% increase in their overall shrink as a direct result of self-checkout, my guess is they probably don't have the right controls in place. Because, as Mike said, the grocery industry has been in this game now for almost 20 years, if you think about it. So we have learned a lot, and we've learned the right way to do this, and we've also learned the wrong way to do this. Some of the studies that you're actually suggesting now would say that if you were to roll this out for every 1% of usage at those check stands or those robots, that you can expect to see 1 basis point in shrink. So if you use that as a model, and it's a pretty exhaustive study that was done over in Europe by Adrian Beck and Colin Peacock, and I think that those numbers are real. What it does is it incentivizes loss prevention groups not to be isolated or having tunnel vision and complaining that this thing is coming. It's already here. The reality is you need to work with your merchants, you need to work with your IT group, you certainly need to work with your operators, and it starts with who are you putting at that particular self-checkout to actually man it? Are you taking the low person on the totem pole that typically struggles with running a register and you can't find a place for them, so you're going to put them in that environment? Probably not. If you are, guess what? You might end up with 30%. But the reality is there's a multitude of things that you can do in order to minimize that exposure. And let's not forget the cost savings that you're going to see with labor by putting it in. And there needs to be a balance between the two. I think oftentimes what scares loss prevention executives or loss prevention practitioners is we're going to go to self-checkout, and then they're not involved. And when they're not involved, that's when you see problems and issues like you just discussed in that one study, I think. So as long as you put the controls in place, everything from the design of the cart corrals, where you're bringing people in, it's loss prevention by environmental design. I mean, the software that you're tying into, we have POS exception-based monitoring linked to video and have for years now. When we use that as part of a defense mechanism, at least to try and counter some of the theft things that are occurring. So I would not encourage people to say that this is a bad thing. I would encourage loss prevention executives to step up to the plate and say, It's now time really to start working cross-functionally with every one of those business owners that are impacted by this. And again, merchandising, certainly IT, certainly store operations, asset protection, those are really the four main groups. You get their heads together and you say, okay, we're going to go with this. What are the best controls that we can implement in order to minimize our losses?
Mm-hmm. You know, there's switching subjects just a little bit and going to another method, another customer transaction. These past holidays, I guess, BOPIS, buy online, pick up in store, increased significantly. I mean, we're talking 47 to 67%. I mean, there's a couple of different numbers out there, but that's a huge number, okay? What is the implications from an LP perspective? In how does that impact that front end? And in what should a retailer do to really get to manage that process so you don't see a shrink impact?
Well, I think some of it goes to the heart of what we just talked about. Who is it that's going out and actually picking up the product, putting it in the tote, storing it, actually scanning or taking the transaction, and more importantly, who's taking it outside? I mean, let's be real. In the past, if you wanted to be a dishonest cashier, you would literally sit at the frontline registers and you'd either manipulate the register and decrease the transaction dollars, or you just simply pass the scanner. Now, gosh, we give you the keys to the castle and all you need to do is just walk out the door and start loading up everybody and anybody. And here's what's interesting about that, it all looks normal.
Yeah.
It all looks normal as long as the customer is going into the right parking space. So once again, I think, who are you putting in those positions to go out the door and to do these things? They have to be quality associates. They have to be vetted. And if you're not doing those kinds of things, then I think you're going to get hurt.
I think Dan, you're spot on. I mean, you got to have operational rigor. You have to understand where are the thresholds for opportunity for loss, and you got to design and build a program that helps you prevent that. And then you got to measure it, and you got to audit it, right? I mean, you've got to look at, it's the proverbial inspect what you expect. And then back to the earlier question on self-checkout and the amount of loss. I think it's going to vary from retailer to retailer based on the very things you described. You know, do you have, you know, it takes a village, you know, between IT, your AP, your field operators, all the folks that piece something like self-checkout or buy online, pick up in store in terms of its program design. So I think engagement's the key word. You know, AP's got to be at the table. They got to be having discussions. And they got to be having the what if conversations. Well, what if this happens? Then does that lend itself to increased risk? And if it does, what are we going to do to mitigate it? And the other thing I would add is, and I think Dan said it, hey, self-checkout's on us. It's coming. It's coming fast and furiously. And I think it's a good thing for retail. I think for us, we just have to be diligent and we have to keep our eye on the shrink thing.
How is Amazon Go affecting the retail industry? I mean, going cashierless seems to be on everybody's minds. You know, how far off is it? And do you think it really truly will be adopted by a large enough piece of the retail market?
It's possible. I mean, if you look at what they're doing, they're starting off, first of all, with a very, very small footprint. There is not a lot of merchandise in those boxes. But as you begin to take a look at what they're doing, make no mistake about it. They're positioning themselves, they're learning, and they are data-centric like no other retailer that I've ever seen in my entire career. The amount of investment that they make just in R&D is just baffling compared to what most retailers do. So I can't speak for them like Mike can't speak for a lot of other companies, but the reality is there is going to be a time when that's going to get here. Whether or not that's now, I think we're going through a transformation. I think if you look at self-checkout, it started with some robots or some mechanical devices that were not very good 20 years ago. Right. They got a lot better 8 years ago, and the level of sophistication now, even from a control standpoint, is so much better today than it was just 8 or 10 years ago. I think we're seeing this migration going from the robots, and then we're going to have, I think we'll eventually get to mobile, which is what you're talking about, so on and so forth. But I don't think we're quite there yet, but make no mistake, it's coming.
Yep. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
Is that could that be also fueling the potential of AP and IT security converging? Could it cause more convergence? Could it be a factor involved in that?
I think those two entities today have more of a necessity to work closely together than they ever have certainly in my time in this profession. You know, IT security and building and designing a program that helps prevent or mitigate loss is just absolutely critical. And you won't have it absent of that partnership. I don't see the two entities becoming one. I just see the two entities in lockstep with one another, as you said about the task of transforming stores and transforming the front end. You know, I've been saying for a few years now, the front end to me is not a new frontier, it's the next frontier. You know, we spend a lot of time at the back door with what we receive. We spend a lot of time on the sales floor with what's on the shelf. And we've traditionally spent a good bit of time, in my opinion, as an industry looking at point of sale with a SAP register. But outside of that, we're all learning. And it's moving very fast. So, you know, I think technology and the rate with which it's changing will make things like Amazon Go a standard thing down the road. When that happens, who knows? But it's coming, and I think Amazon set the bar.
I think the IT piece, you know, and the merging of asset protection and IT with this on this particular subject is probably, if they're not already working together, is probably going to be driven by the operators. Because let's be real, when you're into self-checkout, you are really into both an intentional and an unintentional shrink driver. The intentional piece is obvious, right? I mean, we were sort of joking earlier once Mike was talking about some of the produce or perishables, and immediately I said, yeah, you're talking about self-checkout. And I said, yeah, 4011. What's that? Well, those are bananas, okay? I set down 3 pounds of bananas, and I'm going on my self-checkout, and the reality is, you know, I might have green grapes, so rather than 69 cents a pound, all of a sudden, you know, I'm paying 69 cents a pound instead of $3.98 a pound. Oh, well, that's only $12, but that's $12 for every single transaction. And when we get into self-checkout, at least in my world, the number one PLU that we see that is consistently used to take down a transaction is bananas 4011. So I think, you know, that's the intentional piece, but then there's also the unintentional. How does a customer know the difference between, you know, a Macintosh apple and a Red Delicious apple? There might be as much as $1 difference between the two. That's the nudging, I think, that Mike was talking about. Right. And oftentimes these unintentional mistakes, which are really operationally, right? You have to program these systems to help the customer or the consumer to get really, really smart. Whether or not they want to or not is a whole different program. So, but I think the operations group will probably drive that merger if they're not already working together right now, because at the end of the day, for the most part, the operations group tends to own the vast majority of shrink in just about every retailer that I've been in.
You know, any advice or suggestions for our field executives about how all of this is changing their jobs in what they can do to better prepare, to better develop themselves, and to minimize the risk factors?
Well, you know, we talked about this a little bit about cybersecurity earlier. The only advice that I would give is don't shy away from it. I mean, the reality is when you're dealing with self-checkout, the sophistication of the programs that are within your toolbox, the software that drives these robots and these lanes is very, very powerful. Which ones you decide to enact within your business model and what you are willing to put up with, how many interventions with a customer are really going to be up to that collective group, mainly operations, IT. How many times do you want someone to go and check or follow up on somebody that is at the lane? I mean, it can be everything from something as simple as weight. Do I want weight as part of my self-checkout or don't I? And you would be surprised at how many retailers out there today that have simply turned that control off as they're scanning an item and putting it down because of the number of interventions. Now, oftentimes, that's because they're using older machines. So my point is, don't shy away from it. Learn about the software. Learn about every single control so that when you're sitting in a meeting, you can articulate to operators, you can articulate to IT people on what the needs of the business are, and then measure the interventions and either back off or make them much more difficult to beat.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, ask questions, seek answers. And the thing you have to be careful of too is you can't throw the net over the good customer. You know, and I think we'd all agree the vast percentage that pass through self-checkout have good intentions and are legitimate, customers. There's a certain percent that aren't. And so whatever mousetrap you build it for that 3%. and allow the others to flow freely. And that's easy to say, it's a little bit more difficult to do, but I think that's a big piece of it too.
Gentlemen, thanks for being here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Gus.
Thank you, guys, appreciate it.
Well, that's it for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to thank you for watching, and until next time, let's keep them all safe out there.